Hello, my name is Elliott. I'm the editor of Personal Finance as well as the Energy Strategist. Today I want to talk a little bit about oil and in particular the deepwater drilling market. We've really seen in recent years a lot of the big onshore oil fields that have been sort of the bastion of global production really become very mature and begin to see declining production. Obviously that's a trend that's been underway for decades really outside of OPEC. Places like most of the big fields in Texas in the U.S. are obviously in decline, Alaska as well, and we've seen really declining production in the United States since the early 1970s. The North Sea fields in Europe as well have been in decline for well over a decade now, and we're really seeing declining production all over non-OPEC nations. Inside of OPEC, actually there's much less data available, but there are signs that some of the big oil fields in places like Saudi Arabia are not going to see a whole lot of additional production growth. They are developing some new smaller fields, but again, the fields that they're going after, even in OPEC, are a lot more complicated, a lot more complex to produce, expensive to produce fields than was the case, say, 20 years ago. Outside of OPEC, however, there is one area that is seeing increases in production. Increasingly, most of the big fields you're hearing discovered are in the deep water. Just in early September, we heard about a new BP find in the Gulf of Mexico called Tiber. Earlier this year, we heard of a number of finds in deepwater Brazil made by Petrobras. And also we've heard a lot about a number of fields in West Africa, off the coast of West Africa, also in deepwater environments. And the truth is, this is really a symptom of a theme that I've had in the Energy Strategist for a long time, which I call the end of easy oil. Basically, as these large onshore fields mature and see declining production, producers are increasingly looking at more complicated fields that are in harsher environments, much more difficult to produce fields, and a lot of those are being found in the deep water. An area is emerging globally which we call the Deepwater Golden Triangle. The original Golden Triangle was actually in Texas, was in the early 20th century when they discovered the Spindletop well, was really Port Arthur, Orange, and Beaumont, Texas. The new Deepwater Golden Triangle is actually off the coast of Brazil, deepwater Gulf of Mexico, and deepwater West Africa. About 80% of all global spending on deep water is going to happen within this Golden Triangle. So there's a lot of money moving into this area. Just to sort of talk briefly about each leg of that triangle. Off the coast of Brazil, you've probably heard of a number of the finds over the last couple of years. There's a Tupi oil field. There's probably as much as 5 to 8 billion barrels of oil equivalent reserves, making it the largest field discovered in the Americas in decades and largest field, in fact, discovered anywhere in the world since Kashagan. So it's a huge oil field, eventually could yield out of a number of wells as much as 1 million barrels a day in production. Now it's very important to remember that you will hear often in the media when they announce these big finds, you hear a lot of people talk about the reserves in the play. But the reality is that doesn't matter as much as how much and when can that oil be produced. In this case, it doesn't really matter whether Tupi has 5 billion barrels of recoverable reserves or 8 billion barrels of recoverable reserves. The point is, how fast can it be produced? The reality of that, of course, is that it takes anywhere from 5 to 10 years to bring a field like Tupi into production. In this case, Petrobras doesn't think they're going to see sort of maximum production from Tupi until 2017. And when that happens, it could be around 1 million, maybe as much as 1.5 million barrels of oil a day. Again, that's out of an 85 million barrel a day global oil market. So it's not going to necessarily flood the globe with supplies, but it will mean growth in production for the nation of Brazil. In fact, Brazil is expected to as much as double its oil production between now and 2020. It's one of the only countries in the world that's going to see an increase in production. And it's all due to these fields they're finding in the very deep water off the coast of Brazil. Now, Tupi specifically is in water as much as 10,000 feet deep. Very complicated reserve to find. And then under the seafloor, they're actually drilling more than 2 miles to get to the oil reserve laterally through a very thick layer of salt. The total well length, and a lot of the wells they're drilling in the Tupi area, are more than 25,000 feet. So it's a very complicated well to produce, a very expensive wells to drill, a very complicated reserve to produce. And therefore it requires a lot of work from the services companies to actually make this technically possible. However, there are some big reserves there, and some big impact for companies like Petrobras, which is the national oil company in Brazil, that are going to be the main producers in these fields. Deepwater Gulf, one of the biggest finds announced recently is the Tiber oil field. It's a BP oil field. That was actually the longest well ever drilled anywhere in the world to produce that field. 38,000 feet in total length, or close to it. Again, very complicated through a layer of salt, but potentially well over 3 billion barrels of recoverable reserves. So it could be one of the most prolific fields discovered in the U.S. ever. And it could produce as much as 200, maybe 300,000 barrels a day when it hits maximum production. Again, that's likely to be about a decade away. And again, you want to focus on the production, not necessarily the reserve base there, but a very high impact field for the United States nonetheless.